In December 1979, Soviet troops crossed the border into Afghanistan. What was officially framed as a limited intervention to support a friendly government would grow into one of the longest and most damaging conflicts of the Cold War. It was a war that reshaped Afghanistan at every level of society, drained the Soviet system from within, and helped set in motion political and security dynamics that would continue to influence global affairs long after the fighting ended. Afghanistan had long resisted outside control, and not only because of its people. Geography alone worked against any occupying force. The country's landscape is defined by towering mountain ranges, narrow valleys, arid plains, and harsh deserts. These features divided the country into isolated regions, limiting movement and complicating communication. Roads were few and often poorly maintained. Many villages were reachable only on foot or by animal paths that wound through mountains and ravines. For centuries, power in Afghanistan had been local rather than centralized. Authority flowed through tribal elders, religious leaders, and family networks rather than through a strong national government. Loyalty to the state was secondary to loyalty to clan, faith, and region. Any foreign force attempting to impose order faced not just military resistance, but a deeply rooted social structure resistant to outside influence. History had already delivered its warning. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the British Empire had fought multiple wars in Afghanistan. Despite superior firepower and organization, British forces failed to secure lasting control. Military victories proved temporary, and political authority remained elusive. Afghanistan earned a reputation as a place where foreign armies entered with confidence and left with frustration, losses, and a deeper understanding of their limits. By the late 1970s, Afghanistan was already fractured internally. In April 1978, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power in what became known as the Sour Revolution. The new government, aligned closely with the Soviet Union, promised sweeping reforms. It sought to modernize the country rapidly through land redistribution, expanded education, and the reduction of religious influence in public life. These reforms were introduced with little understanding of local realities. In many areas, land redistribution disrupted traditional ownership systems that had governed rural life for generations. Religious leaders, who held immense authority in Afghan society, were marginalized or arrested. Social reforms were enforced through state power rather than dialogue, turning modernization into coercion. The backlash was swift and intense. In rural Afghanistan, these policies were viewed as an assault on Islam, family structure, and cultural identity. Resistance began almost immediately. Villages revolted. Government officials were targeted. Armed groups formed organically, often led by local commanders rather than national figures. What began as scattered uprisings soon spread across large portions of the country. The government responded with repression. Arrests, torture, and executions became common tools of control. Rather than restoring order, these measures deepened resentment and expanded the rebellion. Even within the Afghan military, loyalty collapsed. Soldiers deserted, defected, or simply refused to fight. Entire units disintegrated, leaving weapons and territory in the hands of insurgents. By 1979, the situation was spiraling. The Kabul government was losing control outside major cities. Appeals to Moscow for direct military assistance grew more desperate. Inside the Soviet leadership, fears mounted. Afghanistan bordered Soviet Central Asia, and instability was seen as a potential threat to internal security. There was also concern that a collapse of the Afghan regime could shift regional influence toward the United States or its allies. After months of debate, hesitation, and conflicting intelligence assessments, the decision was made to intervene militarily. The Soviet invasion began in late December 1979. Elite units moved quickly to seize key infrastructure. Airports, government buildings, and communication centers were secured. Afghan leader Hafiz al-Amin, viewed as unreliable and increasingly erratic, was removed in a violent operation and killed. In his place, Babrak Karmal was installed as a more compliant leader. In Moscow, expectations remained optimistic. The intervention was viewed as temporary. Soviet planners believed that a show of force would stabilize the government, intimidate resistance groups, and allow for a rapid withdrawal. Instead, Soviet forces entered a war with no clear front lines and no conventional enemy. The resistance forces, collectively referred to as the Mujahideen, were highly fragmented. They were divided along ethnic, regional, ideological, and personal lines. Some groups were nationalist, others deeply religious. Leadership was decentralized, often built around charismatic commanders rather than formal hierarchies. What united them was opposition to foreign occupation and rejection of the Kabul government. The Mujahideen avoided direct confrontation whenever possible. They relied on guerrilla tactics shaped by terrain and local knowledge. Convoys were ambushed in mountain passes. Roads were mined. Isolated bases were attacked under cover of darkness. Fighters struck quickly and withdrew before Soviet units could respond effectively. Borders played a critical role. Pakistan provided sanctuary, allowing fighters to retreat, regroup, and train beyond Soviet reach. Supply routes through neighboring countries ensured a steady flow of weapons and recruits. This external support transformed the conflict from a domestic rebellion into a prolonged international proxy war. For Soviet troops, the experience was deeply unsettling. The enemy was invisible most of the time. Danger was constant but unpredictable. Patrols moved through landscapes that offered countless hiding places. Villages could appear peaceful by day and hostile by night. Trust was scarce. To counter this, Soviet commanders relied heavily on overwhelming firepower. Artillery barges, airstrikes, and helicopter assaults became standard. Entire areas were targeted in attempts to deny the Mujahideen shelter, food, and mobility. While militarily effective in the short term, these tactics devastated civilian life. Villages were destroyed. Crops were burned. Livestock was killed. Irrigation systems were damaged. Millions of Afghans were forced to flee, creating one of the largest refugee crises of the late 20th century. Families crossed borders on foot, carrying little more than what they could hold. Refugee camps became permanent settlements, shaping Afghan society for generations. As the war continued, foreign involvement deepened. Afghanistan became one of the central proxy battlegrounds of the Cold War. The United States and its allies viewed support for the Mujahideen as a way to weaken the Soviet Union without direct confrontation. Weapons, funding, and training flowed in, often channeled through regional intelligence services. One of the most significant developments was the introduction of advanced anti-aircraft weapons. Portable missile systems allowed Mujahideen fighters to target Soviet helicopters and aircraft effectively. This challenged Soviet air dominance, which had been crucial to mobility and fire support. Aircraft losses increased, missions became riskier, and the psychological impact on Soviet forces was severe. For the soldiers on the ground, Afghanistan was exhausting and confusing. Many were young conscripts with minimal training. They faced extreme climates, cultural isolation, and a constant sense of vulnerability. Combat was irregular and often sudden. Long periods of monotony were broken by moments of intense violence. Morale declined steadily. Alcohol and drug use increased. Discipline suffered. Psychological trauma was widespread, though rarely acknowledged. At home, information about the war was tightly controlled. Families were given limited details. Casualties were downplayed. Soldiers who died were returned in sealed coffins, often without explanation. As the years passed, the cost of the war became impossible to ignore. The Afghan government remained dependent on Soviet support. The resistance remained resilient. Casualties mounted. Equipment losses increased. The economic burden grew heavier, contributing to broader systemic strain within the Soviet Union. By the mid-1980s, the political climate had shifted. Economic stagnation, public dissatisfaction, and the push for reform forced Soviet leadership to reconsider. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he openly questioned the war's purpose. He referred to Afghanistan as a bleeding wound and acknowledged that a military solution was unattainable. Diplomatic efforts followed. Negotiations involving regional and international actors led to agreements outlining withdrawal. In 1988, Soviet forces began pulling out in stages. The withdrawal was carefully managed, both militarily and symbolically, to preserve dignity and avoid the appearance of collapse. In February 1989, the last Soviet soldier crossed the border out of Afghanistan. The war, however, did not end there. Afghanistan was left deeply scarred. The communist government survived briefly before collapsing. Former resistance groups turned against one another, plunging the country into civil war. Out of that chaos emerged the Taliban and later international extremist networks whose origins could be traced back to conflict. For the Soviet Union, the war became a defining failure. It exposed structural weaknesses, undermined confidence in leadership, and accelerated the collapse of the state itself. Afghanistan became a symbol of overreach, miscalculation, and the limits of military power. The Soviet-Afghan War stands as a reminder that strength alone does not guarantee success. It shows how foreign intervention can entangle a nation in a conflict it does not fully understand against an enemy it cannot decisively defeat. What began as an attempt to stabilize a neighbor became a prolonged struggle with no clear victory, only loss, exhaustion, and consequences that continue to shape the world today. If you appreciate restored historical footage and stories like this, make sure to subscribe to History Safe. Your support helps keep these rare moments from the past alive and accessible. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with others who love history.